They planned for war. They didn't plan for love, loyalty, and sacrifice. The war that LOOKED perfect ON paper the alien coalition did not prepare for war. They solved it. Long before the first shot was fired, the conflict already existed inside vast computation chambers orbiting distant stars. Billions of variables flowed through crystalline processors older than most civilizations. Species behavior models, tactical doctrines, psychological thresholds, cultural collapse points. Every known form of resistance had been reduced to data. War, to the coalition, was no longer an art. It was accounting. When humanity first appeared in those calculations, the processors barely slowed. A young species. Fragmented politics, emotion-heavy decision-making, technological inconsistency, high creativity but low discipline, strong individual attachment bonds that interfered with optimal survival behavior, projected outcome, rapid defeat. The coalition assigned humanity a failure probability of 99.8%. The remaining 0.2 was statistical noise. Humanity never knew how close it came to being erased without ever understanding why. The first contact was unremarkable: trade envoys, border misunderstandings, minor territorial disputes resolved through arbitration. Humans were polite, curious, and slightly overwhelmed by the scale of the galaxy. They learned quickly, asked too many questions, and showed an irritating tendency to empathize with species that barely tolerated them. Alien diplomats recorded this as weakness. Humans called it decency. The spark came quietly. A resource corridor, a disputed relay system, a human colony established on a marginal world that the coalition had already marked for future exploitation. Notices were sent, legal frameworks invoked. Humans were asked to evacuate within a reasonable timeframe. Human leadership responded with confusion, not defiance. They asked for extensions, time to relocate civilians, time to dismantle infrastructure safely, time to avoid unnecessary deaths. The coalition granted a limited delay. The simulation said compliance was inevitable. It wasn't. When the deadline passed, the human colony was still there, not fortified, not militarized, just occupied, families, engineers, medical stations. Children whose only crime was being born on a world someone else wanted. The coalition dispatched a corrective force. Not an invasion, not a war, a demonstration. The numbers predicted zero resistance. Human resistance was immediate, not effective, not elegant, immediate. Civilian ships blocked orbital firing lanes. Mining vessels rammed targeting platforms. Human patrol craft, outdated and underpowered, engaged coalition escorts knowing full well they could not win. Coalition commanders were surprised but unconcerned. Losses were negligible. The demonstration continued. What unsettled them was not what humans did, it was why. Human ships did not maneuver for advantage, they maneuvered for coverage. They shielded evacuation corridors. They stayed in weapons range longer than logic allowed. They absorbed damage that should have triggered retreat protocols. The models flagged the behavior as irrational persistence. The coalition adjusted. On the ground, something similar occurred. Human evacuation efforts were chaotic but relentless. Civilians refused priority boarding if strangers were still waiting. Medics stayed behind long after transports were full. Engineers dismantled reactors by hand to prevent catastrophic failure, even as orbital bombardment began. Coalition analysts observed all of this through drone feeds and sensor arrays. They did not understand it. Humans were behaving as if individual survival was optional. That assumption had never been part of any model. The colony fell. Eventually, human ships were destroyed. Surface resistance collapsed. Coalition forces secured the system at a cost far higher than projected, but still within acceptable parameters. The models recalculated. Human morale should have shattered. Instead, something else happened. Human news of the event spread faster than coalition intelligence expected. Not the destruction, the stories. A transport pilot who made 5 evacuation runs through active fire and died on the 6th. A civilian who gave up a seat for a stranger's child. A ground unit that held a corridor for hours so medical personnel could escape. These details had no military value, but they mattered. Human reaction across their territories was immediate and visceral. Recruitment surged. Civil defense networks activated spontaneously. Civilian populations donated resources, labor, and time without being asked. Human governments struggled to control the response. The war had not yet begun, and already humanity was mobilizing. Coalition analysts updated the psychological model. They added emotional contagion variables. Grief amplification, collective identity reinforcement. These were known phenomena. The projections shifted slightly. Human resistance duration extended from weeks to months, still irrelevant. The formal declaration of war came later. Clean, precise, unemotional. The coalition issued it not as a threat, but as a notification. Hostilities would commence. Objectives were defined. Termination conditions specified. Humanity was offered surrender terms in advance. Human leadership reviewed the document in silence. Then they sent a response. It was not a counterproposal. It was a list. Names of civilians killed in the first action, medical ships destroyed, evacuation corridors fired upon. At the end of the message was a single line: "We don't accept this." The coalition did not reply. They began the campaign. The opening phase unfolded exactly as predicted. Coalition fleets overwhelmed human defenses. Human shipyards were neutralized. Communication hubs disabled. Entire systems fell in sequence. Human commanders attempted conventional defense and failed. The numbers were flawless. Humanity was losing. What the numbers did not capture was behavior under loss. Human fleets did not withdraw cleanly. They broke apart, scattering into smaller units. Commanders gave broad directives and then disappeared from the network. Individual captains made decisions based not on doctrine but circumstance. Human ships fought on partial power, on jury-rigged systems, on backups that were never meant to last. When ammunition ran out, they rammed. When engines failed, they became obstacles. When survival was no longer possible, they became time. Coalition forces began encountering resistance in places already cleared. Human ships emerging from debris fields days after battles had ended. Ground teams sabotaging infrastructure hours after occupation. Civilians interfering with supply chains through acts too small to predict but too numerous to stop. The models adjusted again. Human collapse was delayed, still inevitable. Then came the incident that forced the coalition to flag humanity as anomalous. A medical convoy, unarmed, clearly marked, transmitting continuously. Coalition doctrine allowed safe passage. Destroying medical units provided no strategic benefit and risked diplomatic backlash. A junior coalition commander ignored the doctrine. He calculated that eliminating the convoy would demoralize nearby human resistance. The strike was executed. The effect was explosive. Human retaliation was immediate and disproportionate, not strategically, emotionally. Human forces across 3 sectors abandoned optimal positioning to attack coalition assets linked, however indirectly, to the convoy's destruction. Supply depots, relay stations, patrol craft. Anything associated with that command signature was targeted. Human losses were catastrophic. They did not stop. Coalition analysts watched in disbelief as human units knowingly entered kill zones with no chance of success. Except one, they succeeded in making the point. Intercepted human transmissions flooded coalition databases. They were not tactical. They were personal. They were helping people. They were unarmed. You don't get to do that. The coalition had no response framework for this. Punishment without strategic gain made no sense, but the humans were not acting strategically. They were acting morally. The models began to fail, not dramatically, subtly. Timelines slipped. Resource costs climbed. Human resistance did not degrade along expected curves. Instead of collapse, there was compression. Human behavior became more focused, more intense, as if loss was not discouraging them, but sharpening them. A senior coalition analyst submitted a private memorandum. Human motivation appears to strengthen in direct correlation with perceived injustice. The memo was archived. No action taken. By the end of the first full cycle, humanity had lost more than any rational species would tolerate. Worlds, fleets, millions of lives. And yet they were still fighting, not because they believed they could win, but because they believed they had to. The coalition had calculated everything: weapons, tactics, numbers. They had accounted for fear. They had accounted for despair. They had accounted for survival. What they had not accounted for was what humans did when survival was no longer the point, and the war was only beginning. When loss became a weapon, the coalition had faced stubborn species before. Fanatics, zealots, cultures that preferred extinction to submission. Those wars were short. Humanity was different. Humans did not seek death. They simply refused to let it decide for them. By the second phase of the war, coalition commanders noticed a disturbing shift. Human forces were no longer defending territory in any meaningful way. Borders blurred. Front lines dissolved. Strategic worlds were abandoned without protest. At first, this was celebrated. Human collapse appeared imminent. Then the ambushes began. Human attacks no longer targeted fleets at full strength. They struck after battles, after repairs, after victory celebrations. Lone human ships emerged from deep space, damaged but functional, targeting logistics vessels, fuel depots, and repair docks. They did not stay to fight. They burned resources and vanished. Coalition doctrine demanded pursuit. Human doctrine, if it could even be called that, demanded exhaustion. The coalition recalculated again. Human resistance was now classified as asymmetric persistence warfare, a polite term. The internal reports were less restrained. They are turning loss into leverage. Human fleets began operating without centralized command. This terrified coalition strategists. Every known military culture depended on hierarchy. Remove leadership and resistance fractured. Remove supply and it starved. Humans adapted instead. If a commander died, someone else took over. If communications failed, ships operated independently. If supply lines broke, civilians filled the gap, repurposing factories, salvaging wreckage, converting civilian technology into military stopgaps. Nothing was standardized. Everything worked. Coalition forces started encountering human weapons that should not exist. Railguns built from mining equipment. Plasma containment fields stabilized with medical-grade components. Navigation systems held together by civilian software never intended for combat. These weapons failed often, but humans did not need them to last forever. They only needed them to last once. The true turning point came during the siege of Caro's Gate. Caro's was not important. It had no major population centers, no irreplaceable resources. Its only value was logistical, a junction for coalition fleets moving deeper into human territory. Coalition command assumed a swift capture. Human forces did not contest the approach. They let the fleets enter. What followed baffled every model. Human resistance did not attempt to hold the gate. They collapsed it. Civilian engineers, still on site, overloaded the relay core manually. No remote access. No evacuation window. They stayed until the last second, ensuring the detonation would cripple the structure completely. The explosion destroyed the gate and half the coalition fleet passing through it. Human losses were total. Coalition losses were unacceptable. Coalition analysts struggled to categorize the event. It was not a tactical victory. It was a statement. Human transmissions following the explosion were brief. You don't get to use our space like it doesn't matter. Coalition morale, once considered irrelevant, began to degrade. Officers questioned orders that placed them near human systems. Crews reported elevated stress indicators when engaging human forces. Commanders noticed hesitation during pursuit operations. The coalition had never encountered an enemy that seemed so willing to erase value rather than surrender it. Humanity was not defending assets. They were defending meaning. Coalition countermeasures intensified. Entire human worlds were blockaded. Infrastructure was dismantled with precision. Population centers were isolated rather than destroyed, starving resistance without creating martyrs. This should have worked. Instead, it created something worse. Human civilians did not riot. They organized. Local networks formed independent support systems. Information flowed through unconventional channels, art, music, personal messages, shared stories. Resistance cells did not recruit through ideology but through connection. A mother feeding neighbors, a teacher sheltering children, a mechanic repairing generators long after supplies ran out. Coalition surveillance flagged these behaviors as non-hostile. Human resistance weaponized them anyway. The coalition attempted psychological warfare. They broadcast casualty numbers, displayed images of ruined cities, issued projections of inevitable defeat. Human response was muted. Then came a counter-broadcast, a compilation of human faces, names, smiles, ordinary moments. At the end, a message: they mattered. That's enough. The broadcast spread beyond coalition containment within hours. The analysts shut it down, too late. Human soldiers began carrying personal items into battle. Photographs, letters, handmade tokens. Coalition observers interpreted this as emotional vulnerability. It was the opposite. These objects were not distractions. They were anchors. During the Battle of Aurelian Drift, a coalition cruiser disabled a human frigate. Boarding teams moved in to secure prisoners. They found no surrender. The human crew had vented the ship's atmosphere manually and sealed themselves inside engineering compartments to overload the reactor. Coalition forces retreated. The frigate detonated, along with the cruiser. The Coalition Command Council convened in emergency session. The models were no longer predictive. They were descriptive. They explained what had happened, not what would. A senior strategist summarized the problem bluntly. They are not trying to win. They are trying to make a stop. Silence followed. Stopping was not an option. The coalition escalated again. They authorized cornering protocols. Human forces would no longer be allowed space to retreat. No safe corridors, no partial victories. No breathing room. The goal was annihilation through compression. If humanity could not maneuver, their persistence would break. The Council approved the strategy unanimously. They had no idea what they had just done. The first system subjected to cornering protocols was Helios Reach. Human forces there were minimal. A few defensive platforms, scattered ships, civilian populations too small to matter. Coalition fleets moved in from all vectors. Human response was delayed, suspiciously delayed. When coalition ships entered close orbit, human transmissions activated across the system. Not pleas, not threats. Recordings, voices of civilians, soldiers, children, messages sent in advance. If you're hearing this, it means we didn't make it. Coalition commanders ordered the channels muted. They were already too late. Human ships emerged from hiding, not to escape, to attack. Every vessel accelerated directly into coalition formations. Not targeting weapons or engines, but command ships. Coalition fire tore through them. They kept coming. Explosions rippled through the fleet as human ships detonated at point-blank range. The tactic was suicidal. It worked. Human ground forces followed. They did not attempt evacuation. They triggered self-destructs across infrastructure nodes, collapsing orbitals, poisoning fuel reserves, and rendering the system unusable. Helios Reach died. So did the Coalition fleet assigned to it. Coalition Command issued an immediate review. Cornering protocols were suspended. Too late. The message had already spread. Human transmissions flooded every channel the Coalition monitored. A single sentence repeated across systems. Never corner us. For the first time since the war began, Coalition leadership experienced something unfamiliar. Not fear, understanding. Humanity had turned loss into inevitability. Every defeat fed resolve. Every corner created catastrophe. The Coalition had calculated weapons. They had calculated numbers. They had calculated outcomes. What they still did not understand was that humans were no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting to ensure the war hurt. And the galaxy was beginning to learn why that mattered. The variable that broke the galaxy by the time the Coalition understood what had gone wrong, the war had already passed the point where victory meant anything. Humanity had not collapsed. It had changed the definition of winning. Coalition simulations were updated one final time, not to predict success, to calculate acceptable loss. The results were catastrophic. Even in the most optimistic projection, total human extinction, the Coalition's economic, political, and cultural damage extended for centuries. Trade networks destabilized. Peripheral species began questioning Coalition protection. Military confidence, once absolute, fractured into doubt. Humanity had become a cost that never stopped increasing. The Council convened again. This time, not all delegates attended in person. Several worlds had withdrawn representation, citing internal reassessment. Others sent observers instead of decision-makers. The unity that defined the Coalition was cracking, and all of it traced back to a single, impossible variable. Humans did not disengage when survival odds dropped. They committed harder. The Coalition launched one final offensive, not a campaign, a statement, Operation Final Silence. The goal was simple: eliminate Earth, not occupy it. Not negotiate. Erase it so completely that the symbol of humanity would vanish from galactic consciousness. If the heart was the problem, they would remove the heart. Earth had changed. Orbital defenses were crude but dense. Civilian structures had been converted into layered shelters. Cities sprawled underground, interconnected by tunnels dug by volunteers working in shifts that never ended. There was no panic, only preparation. Human leadership made no evacuation plans. They knew there was nowhere left to run. When Coalition fleets entered the system, they expected resistance. They did not expect welcome. Human channels opened across every frequency, not taunts, not threats, stories. A human nurse spoke of staying behind with patients who couldn't move. A farmer described burning his fields so invaders wouldn't eat from them. A child asked whoever was listening to please remember us. Coalition commanders ordered a blackout. The recordings continued anyway. They had been seeded weeks earlier, embedded into space itself, bouncing off satellites, debris, and old probes. The silence they wanted never came. The battle for Earth began. Coalition firepower eclipsed anything humanity could match. Cities burned, orbital platforms shattered, entire continents lost power. And still, human resistance did not collapse. They did not counterattack with fleets. They counterattacked with choice. Human ships rammed supply vessels instead of warships. Civilian pilots flew outdated craft straight into targeting arrays. Ground-based teams launched missiles manually after automated systems failed. Every action screamed the same truth. You can destroy us, but you will never control us. Then came the moment that ended the war. Coalition Command deployed the Heartbreaker, a weapon designed to destabilize planetary cores. One shot, total annihilation. The firing sequence began, and then human channels reopened. A single broadcast, routed through ancient radio frequencies no coalition system had bothered to block. A human voice, calm, tired, unbreakable. You tried to understand us like a problem. We were never a problem. We were a promise to each other. The signal cut. The weapon fired. It never reached the planet. Human engineers, working with nothing but scavenged tech and instinct, had modified Earth's magnetic field generators. Not to block the weapon, to pull it. The Heartbreaker detonated early, inside the Coalition fleet. The explosion tore through command vessels, destabilized formation integrity, and wiped out the entire offensive force in seconds. No follow-up attack came. There was nothing left to attack with. Silence followed. Real silence, not forced. Earned. Weeks passed, then months. Coalition space grew quiet. Human scouts encountered no patrols, no resistance, no pursuit. Then came a transmission. Coalition-wide, unencrypted, unfiltered. A declaration. The war is over, not because you defeated us, but because we finally understand what we cannot afford to lose. The Coalition withdrew, not in triumph, in retreat. Humanity survived, not intact, not unscarred, but undiminished in the only way that mattered. They rebuilt slowly, together. Earth became a place the galaxy spoke of carefully, not with fear, with respect. Centuries later, new species would ask, why doesn't anyone challenge the humans anymore? And the answer was always the same. They calculated everything, the elders would say. Weapons, numbers, outcomes. They just never learned how dangerous a heart can be when it decides to keep beating no matter the cost.